For the past 30 years, this man has lived as a castaway on a remote Australian island. He wanders the beach in flip-flops, catches his own food, and goes shirtless most of the time. You could say he's a modern-day hunter-gatherer, but he's no ordinary beach bum. This man used to be a big-time investor with 2 yachts, multiple homes, and over $30 million to his name. So, what happened? This is the story of David Glasheen, the millionaire who was living the high life until it all came crashing down and he was left homeless. Where that crash took him is a pretty fascinating story that will make you rethink what it really means to be happy. This is a millionaire castaway. Back in the 1980s, David Glasheen's friend showed him a map of Papua New Guinea that changed his life forever. It was a map that his grandfather had come across back in the 1930s. And was filled with descriptions of natural features and topography. It even showed the areas where there could be hostile native tribes. Dave took one look at the wrinkled old map and knew there was an investment opportunity. The price of gold was rising, and he already had several friends in the mining industry who could help him get going. Even better, the Papua New Guinea Mines Department was thrilled by the idea of a large-scale exploration on that land. So, Dave created Carpenter's Investment Trading and went into the mining business. As other investors caught wind of the exciting new project, they clamored to pour money into Dave's new venture. Pretty soon, Carpenter's stock value skyrocketed from 25 cents to $1.40. With millions of shares in his company, that made Dave a multimillionaire. Suddenly, he was living the good life. He had a beautiful wife who was a former model, and they had 2 daughters together. They had property in some of the nicest parts of Sydney and were able to afford lavish vacations. But there was one problem that Dave didn't think about until it was too late. You see, pretty much all of his wealth was tied up in his company shares. His company had taken a lot of capital to get off the ground, and Dave had taken on debt in order to keep things going. He even borrowed money from the bank against the value of his home. As long as his company was doing okay, he'd be fine. But if anything went wrong, well, he had put all of his eggs in one basket. And on October 20th, 1987, everything did go wrong. What Americans remember as Black Monday, Wall Street's largest single-day percentage drop, occurred one day later in Australia, but the effect was just as devastating. The previous Friday, a freak storm had caused Britain's markets to shut down early. The following Monday, Asian markets took a hit and began spiraling out of control. It wasn't long before the turmoil reached the United States, causing the Dow Jones to plummet. From his yacht club in Sydney, Dave followed world events and felt sick to his stomach. On Tuesday, he went down to the Australian Securities Exchange, where the share prices for publicly traded companies like his own were listed on giant electronic boards. He stood there dumbfounded as company after company went into the red. By the end of the day, his shares, which had once been valued at $1.40 each, had fallen to 2 cents. Since his company was seen as a high-risk investment, it was, after all, a literal treasure hunt. Investors pulled out of his company as quickly as they could, leaving Dave high and dry. He spent the next several years trying to keep his life from falling apart. He worked day and night to find new investors and to raise enough capital to keep his explorations going. At one point, his business partner had called him and told him they had just struck gold. Dave was ecstatic. A gold strike meant that he finally had something more than just an X on the map to show to potential investors. For one bright moment, it looked like his nightmare was over. But then the friend corrected himself. It had been a false alarm. There was no gold. It was not long after that the bank took his house. For a guy like Dave, who had spent a good part of his life struggling and sacrificing to provide for his family, that day must have been traumatizing. After years of living in that home, of raising his 2 daughters there, and making all kinds of memories, the bank told him he had 1 hour to vacate the premises. He got there just in time to find the sheriff nailing down the front door. Dave was devastated. He felt like there was no humanity left in the world. Then he had to figure out where to stay. His marriage was falling apart, so his wife took the girls to a neighbor's house. Dave thought about sleeping in his car, which was about the only possession he had left, but it was too cramped. Out of options, he went down to the beach with a blanket and spent the night listening to the rise and fall of the tide. Dave went down to the beach that night out of desperation, but as he sat there and wept at everything he had lost, he had no idea that one day he would be living on another beach all alone, and that he would spend 3 decades there. That beach was on Renovation Island. And like any marooned sailor, Dave was saved by that island. Restoration Island has saved more than one desperate man over the years. When it was named by Captain William Bligh in 1789, he had just been kicked off his own ship, the HMS Bounty, by his mutinous crew. They left him and a few loyal men in the middle of the open ocean on a little boat with just a few days' worth of food. Bligh didn't even have charts to navigate by. After floating for 47 days and on the verge of death, the group came upon the little island. That discovery was the only thing that saved him and his men from starvation and dehydration. It saved Dave too. He may not have been facing immediate death, but he was certainly in a desperate situation. After losing his company, his wife, and his home, Dave did his best to rebound. He started working more than ever, but he was making very little money. He tried relationships with several women, but nothing worked out. Eventually, he fell in love with a Zimbabwean woman named Denise. They ran a spa together and sold a kind of beef jerky on the side. But he couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. He didn't understand how people could live like this, working constantly. He needed an escape. That's when Denise suggested he find a private island. Now, if you're wondering how Dave could afford to buy a private island when he was barely making ends meet, you're not alone. When Dave mentioned the idea to a real estate agent friend of his, he just laughed at him. Dave was asking for the perfect island. Great beaches, no mosquitoes, and with plenty of trees. How was he going to find an island like that, let alone pay for it? But Dave wasn't worried about the details. He wanted to get away from the rat race, and he was set on finding his desert island. So, his buddy took him out to a couple of islands. As soon as Dave reached Restoration Island, he immediately fell in love with the pristine white beaches, the clear blue waters, and the stunning views. Dave knew that this was his home. He could practically hear the gentle island breeze whispering his name. But then he heard the price tag, $1.2 million. Uh-oh. But like I said, Dave wasn't worried about the details. He convinced a group of friends to put up the $1.2 million to lease the land. But there was just one catch. In exchange, Dave and his buddies would have to develop the island. For Dave's friends, this wasn't a problem. They began envisioning a kind of eco-resort that would eventually hold up to 60 people and become a thriving tourist destination. But Dave came to hate the idea. He had fallen in love with the natural beauty of the island and thought his friends' designs were hideous. The local Kukuyao people contested the claim, arguing that they had never been consulted. They pointed out that they had been living in and around Restoration Island well before any European had set foot on the island. The Kukuyao people lost that court case, but in the midst of the legal battle, Dave had been won over to their cause. He no longer wanted anything to do with any development projects, and he was tired of waiting around for the legal disputes to end. In 1997, he packed a suitcase with 3 shirts, 2 pairs of shorts and swim trunks, a couple of books, chili powder, and toothbrush and toothpaste, and headed for the island. He's been living there ever since. What's it like living on your own desert island? Well, it's not without its challenges, that's for sure. For one thing, the neighbors are a lot deadlier than back in Sydney. There's deadly spiders, which have killed 2 of his dogs, poisonous snakes, which have crawled in bed with Dave on multiple occasions, and a giant crocodile that he calls Boxhead.
Tell me about a certain crocodile earlier.
Oh, yeah, well, Boxhead's out here somewhere.
Boxhead?
Yeah, Boxhead, he's back.
And when something goes wrong and you're alone on an island, the stakes are much higher. Once, Dave got tied up by his fishing lines and dragged out across the sharp rocks.
I've had a few difficult times. I got dragged over the oysters naked and cut from head to toe.
Ouch! It took him a full 2 weeks to recover from that, and not long ago he fell and broke his hip. It took him over an hour to crawl 60 meters back to his house to call for help. Can you imagine? If he hadn't been able to move, he would have died. Still, despite all that, Dave would never go back to his life as a millionaire. On the island, he's not homeless. He's the king of his domain. He fishes in the ocean, collects berries, and harvests oysters right in his backyard. He even entertains visitors from time to time, from teenage backpackers to celebrities like Russell Crowe and the CEO of McDonald's. Dave has had his share of interesting guests to keep him company. Plus, it turns out island living is pretty good for your health. Before coming to Restoration Island, Dave was 60 pounds overweight, battling alcoholism and overwhelmed by stress. Now look at him. Lounging back in his plastic chair, he looks about as relaxed as you can get. And although now he's over 80 years old, he says he feels better than ever. Maybe it's all that running from crocodiles. By the way, in case you're wondering, Dave says it's best to run away in a zigzag pattern to confuse them. Still, there is one thing that Dave feels the island is missing.
I know it gets lonely out here, but who's this?
Well, this is my private girlfriend,
What's her name?
Miranda.
Yeah, that's not creepy at all. But hey, I guess if you can bond with a volleyball named Wilson, you can bond with anything. What Dave really craves is the company of a real woman. He even tried dating online, though with little success. But human company would just be the icing on the cake for Dave. Otherwise, he's happier now than he's ever been in his life.
First 52 years or the last 20 or?
No, the last 20's been the best time of my life. And the next 20 or whatever, or 50
And the
or
rest of it,
whatever,
yeah.
it'll be the same. It'll be even better, you know.
Thanks, Dave.
Funny that he had to lose everything to find happiness.